Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and I recently got to read a 1992 medical report. So we're down here in the recovery ward on Battleship New Jersey to talk about some of the findings in this. This report's remarkable for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that in the 90s, they're still looking at casualties sustained during World War II. Why is that? World War II is the last time you see major naval battles fought. It's the last time we had significant injuries to diagnose. So there have certainly been casualties on Navy ships and injuries. The 7th Fleet ships that got into collisions a couple of years ago are notable examples. The aircraft carriers that had major explosions or fires on board, either their flight decks or their hangar decks, particularly during the Vietnam War, are major examples. But at the end of the day, those are relatively small examples, and they tend to be limited to certain types of ships. Destroyer collisions, submarines hitting underground objects, aircraft carriers having hangar fires. And so it doesn't give you a really good data set for research purposes. World War II had massive amounts of injuries on massive amounts of ships, so it gave the researchers a really great data set. And most importantly, even by the 90s, you're 50 years removed from the war, so these records were pretty well organized. I'm sure they wouldn't argue that after having to sift through it all, but the records were accessible. They were able to go to the National Archives and the Navy's archives and whatever other places and collect the various data that they needed. So they looked at a couple of things: the types of ships that were damaged, the types of damage that those ships took, the types of wounds that sailors sustained, and how long those sailors were injured because of those wounds. And this allows them to make some very important predictions for the future. Naval warfare has changed significantly, but the types of wounds that you're seeing are going to be similar. Being hit by a shell or a bomb or a missile are going to be relatively similar. An underwater mine hit or a torpedo hit are relatively similar to what you're going to see today. And they found, and I suspect they were expecting to find this, and that's why they did the study in the first place, but they found that the type of ship that you served on was a huge predictor in both the type of damage that the ship was going to sustain and the likelihood of you being injured and the amount of time that you were going to be in sick bay because of that injury. If you were on an aircraft carrier, a larger ship, you were likely going to be hit because they were a high priority target, but you were also likely to spend less time in sick bay because they have better medical facilities, they're stronger, they're not being shook as much, you're not being thrown around as much. So they were able to see major predictors for how rapidly the crew could regenerate. And they found that something like 20% of the crew are either injured and are able to go back to work right away or within a couple of days. And so this is very important in predicting that, all right, we can see that a bomb hit's going to cause this many casualties. And you can look at, well, that many casualties is this percentage of the ship's crew, but a certain number of them are going to be back on duty within a relatively short period of time, depending on the type of hit that they take. And that means that they can go back into fighting the ship or performing damage control operations to get the ship back up and fully functional in a battle. So it's all very interesting data. And there's a link to this article down below. It's open source. There's a PDF. I really encourage you to read it. There's some interesting stuff. Be sure to leave a comment in the comment section below with what you thought was interesting in it. Some of the things I found interesting. I love me a good chart. The types of injuries that sailors were sustaining. This is a chart that's available on page 6, and it shows that you're most likely to get a penetrating injury. So that would be like a piece of metal, whether it's from the bomb itself or the bomb blows a piece of metal off of your own ship, and that penetrates some part of your body. 40% of injuries are that sort, and the average sailor is going to spend 46 days in sickbay after receiving that kind of injury. The next most major thing, with about a quarter of all injuries, were burns on a modern ship like this, you're likely to be burned, whether it's from the explosion or the flammable materials around the ship. Multiple injuries, fractures, cuts, concussions are all also very high on the list. Interestingly, non-fatal immersions, like being thrown in water but not drowning, pretty unlikely to put you on the list, 0.2% of injuries. Traumatic amputations, asphyxiation, I was surprised to see so low on the list because of all of the smoke. You've got fires, burns is really high on the list, asphyxiation is really low. The article doesn't really explain things like that. It may be that asphyxiation isn't going to injure you, it's going to kill you. Or it may be things like Navy ships have tons of breathing devices around. If you're going into a smoke-filled room, you're likely wearing an OBA or some other sort of emergency breathing device that's going to prevent you from asphyxiating. So whether it's equipment that's good at preventing that, or if it's just something that, like smoke inhalation, doesn't often send you to sick bay, you're either killed by it or you're able to deal with it on your own. Likewise, strains, dislocations, you have to imagine that there's a lot of those. It seems like those are not going to sick bay, while fractures, bone breaks, things like that are sending you to sick bay. So that's an interesting list. The chart on page 8 that shows you the different types of ships and the different types of damage that those ships sustain is really interesting. I'm less interested in how quickly the crew is able to recover from these, but more interested in what ships are hit. What are they being targeted with? What weapon systems are being sent against them? And what are the enemy prioritizing as their target ships? So battleships, really high on the list, 668 hits. These are American ships, and this can't be all the hits that they sustained, but it's all the ones that they were able to find records for in this study. So battleships are actually your second most likely ship to be on to take a hit. Your least likely ship to be on to take a hit? Heavy cruisers. Only 93 hits sustained by the data that they looked at. So 668 for battleships, 93 for heavy cruisers. Light cruisers is 4 times as likely to take hits. That's interesting. But 3 times as likely as a battleship to take a hit, and the most damaged type of ship in the study, destroyers. Nearly 1,900 total hits. Interestingly, destroyer escorts are broken out separately and are only about 350 hits. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, destroyers are obviously ubiquitous. There's so many of them, it means that they're likely to take a hit. But it's interesting to see that many ships were targeted. They're not exactly high priority targets. But then you look at the type of hits that they're taking. They're hitting a lot of mines where other ships aren't. Destroyers were frequently used for minesweeping or frequently operated closer to shore than other ships where they were more likely to hit mines. And by far, of those 1,900 hits, 1,400 of them, kamikazes. Kamikaze pilots are relatively untrained. They're going to have issues selecting targets, so they'll likely go after the first thing they see, which happens to be the ring of destroyers, which is around the ring of battleships, the ring of carriers. Some of these kamikaze pilots are maybe more sophisticated and are able to get past the destroyer screen and then attack the battleships or carriers, but by far the majority of them go after destroyers. And this is really interesting because the kamikaze, among these various types of damage, mines, torpedoes, gunfire, bombs, or kamikazes, that's probably the closest analog to a modern cruise missile, a guided missile. And without ships like battleships or heavy cruisers in the fleet anymore, destroyers being hit by cruise missiles are probably one of the most likely things if we ever see another major naval battle. So that's another way that this study is really important.
But I came down to land, but now I'm landing at the other end of the runway. Again, I have lost sight of the runway, but I thought I was flying a straight path. But it turns out that just before I landed, instead of landing on the runway, I was landing on the line of planes that were lined up on the tarmac. And so not only did I destroy my own plane, I destroyed several others in that swoop. Well, now, because I was bleeding like a pig, and the glass from my goggles as I crashed all went into my eyes.
And one thing that the study doesn't talk about is how these numbers relate to the modern fleet. Like we just talked about, battleships and heavy cruisers are not in the fleet anymore. Neither destroyer escorts aren't either, but they're roughly analogous to frigates, maybe littoral combat ships. Light carriers and escort carriers aren't really around anymore. And really, aircraft carriers, you're looking at the Essex class here primarily, they're the size of the marine amphibious ships, the Gator freighters. So I would think that's what they're most analogous with. I might argue that the battleships are more analogous to the modern supercarriers than aircraft carrier on this list. A Nimitz-class carrier isn't nearly as well armored, but it's got a very heavy structure and a huge reserve of buoyancy, and so its ability to resist impacts is very similar to that of a battleship. And destroyers might not be analogous to destroyers anymore. We're talking about 2,000-ton World War II era destroyers, not the 10,000-ton Arleigh Burkes that we have tooling around today that are really more analogous to light cruisers. I would have loved to have seen a section in here where the authors talk about that. But the authors are more from a medical background and less from a ship-type background. So that would be interesting research that could be done on this topic in the future. And since '92, when this was written, we still haven't had any major naval battles, so even though we're 30 years further in the future, the research they're doing here is still as relevant as it was 30 years ago. So looking at the types of damage that the ship sustained was the really interesting part for me, but I highly encourage you to read this and look at it for its original intended purpose, to look at how well the crew survives these events, how long they spend in sickbay. It really makes you think about World War II and naval combat in general, the types of devastating wounds that these weapon systems are causing. Kamikazes and bomb hits that are the most prevalent are largely causing burns and penetrations of the body, lacerations, bad wounds like that. And it really gives you a newfound appreciation for the types of damages these ships took, the types of wounds that the sailors on those ships took, and the length of time it took them to get back up and back in the fight. Like I said earlier, about 1 in 5 of them are back in the fight within 3 days. Some of them, though, are wounded so bad, amputations, things like that they never get back in the fight again. So highly encourage you to read this. Again, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What were some of the most interesting things that you saw? Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you're interested in donating to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us and the channel. Thanks for watching.